This is a really critical question, and I'm really honored to be able to participate in this discussion about it. My Japanese American family was interned during World War II. And while I've become a staunch advocate of reparations, in that case, initially, I was very skeptical. The government knew what it was doing. What good, I thought, would an apology from Ronald Reagan do? Luckily, the movement wasn't waiting on my approval, and I got to see how important it was to have the public acknowledgement that the internment had been wrong, educational materials to keep our history from being erased, and compensation that, while merely symbolic, was nonetheless tangible. Perhaps most importantly, redress allowed many people who had been incarcerated to be able to talk about their experiences without shame for the first time in 40 years. But that experience also highlighted some pitfalls of redress and reparations. One is that the reparations themselves can undermine acknowledgement of the wrong. In that case, in Congress, the redress bill was justified by the loyalty we had demonstrated, basically by herding ourselves into concentration camps. We were being rewarded for accommodating rather than resisting the wrong. Another is that it can, and in this case, did exacerbate inter and intra-group divisions. It was used to highlight Japanese Americans as a model minority, a trope that was developed explicitly to blame Black and Brown communities for their dispossession. And compromises were made to exclude various classes of people, including thousands of Japanese Latin Americans who were kidnapped and interned in the US and then excluded from redress because they were, quote, illegal aliens. Their struggles for redress continue 35 years later. The goal of reparations is to make whole, and as international law recognizes, it should be a wide-ranging process that encompasses restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. At the same time, we know that the perpetrators of wrongs, states in this case, are not going to fix the problems that result from any large-scale historical injustice. So for me, there's three key elements that we need to consider in struggling for reparations: truth, dignity, and power. Are we exposing historical truths? Are we enhancing human dignity? And does the process as well as the result empower those who are harmed by the violations? To get there, we have to ask, what are the wrongs at issue? What would it take to repair their consequences? And do the interim steps we advocate lead us toward our ultimate goals, or will they short circuit the process? Based on what I understand about proposals to limit reparations for slavery to lineal descendants of enslaved Africans in what is now the United States, I have several concerns. The main problem I see is that this proposal makes it easy to disregard the pervasive social harm that the legacy of centuries of enslavement has produced. A lot of folks have made that case, so I won't belabor it, but I'd like to highlight the importance in this discussion of the 2001 Durban Declaration and more recently, the 2019 report on reparations by Tendai Yachume, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, both of which emphasize the ongoing legacies of colonialism and enslavement. A second problem is that while this proposal appears to create a fairly straightforward class of potential beneficiaries, it glosses over a very complex history. Just to give one example, many American Indians were enslaved. At one point, there were more Native folks being shipped out of the port of Charleston than there were Africans being brought in. For the most part, Native men were sent to the West Indies to be sold there, while the women were sent to Southern plantations. So I find it really disconcerting to try to divide their descendants so starkly. More generally, this framing erases the fact that by 1619, hundreds of thousands of Africans had been enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. And there's a long and really rich history of Afro-descendant folks traveling between the Caribbean and other places in the Western Hemisphere and the US mainland prior to emancipation. And of course, many people, Haitians, for example, have migrated more recently to the US because of the toll taken in their societies by enslavement. Given all of this, a narrow focus on the lineal descendants of persons enslaved within the US, I think, tends to promote a xenophobic mindset that reifies colonially imposed state borders. It presumes the legitimacy of the state, and it affirms its claims not only to this land, but to the imposition of what Stephen Salaita calls imperative patriotism. You might think about what happened to Colin Kaepernick in that context. Finally, the logistics would just be mind-boggling. Colonialism and enslavement functioned by destroying identity, by brutally suppressing cultures, languages, and religions, by taking away names and stealing people's children. The descendants of those most harmed by these processes will be the least able to prove their lineage. And who would be deciding? Odds are it would work like blood quantum requirements for American Indians, imposed by federal agencies to limit land claims, arbitrarily imposed and relying on lists created by white federal agents after removal, meaning that many of the most traditional people, the ones who escaped and maintained their ways of life, were and remain excluded. To sum up, I fear that the result would be both divisive and inequitable. We know that any form of reparations will be used by those who benefit from the status quo to say that the issue is now resolved. You've been compensated. We don't want to hear any more complaints. To resist that and to continue the struggle for genuine reparations and empowerment, we're going to need a strong and united base. For a long time, it was really difficult to even raise the question of reparations for people of African descent. I don't think it's an accident that now, just as it's becoming recognized as a legitimate claim, the conversation has been redirected in many circumstances from a broad understanding of the wrongs and remedies at issue to a very narrow and divisive question that I think will leave us once again fighting over the scraps. Thanks.